Here we go. Okay, we are all set. Sorry again, trying to work. Here we go. Um, as an indigenous Kanaka of Hawaii and a member of the community here in Oregon, we would like to take this opportunity to mahalo the original caretakers of this land and its people to which we sit and occupy. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia, Willamette, and Tualatin rivers, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and use the plentiful natural resources of the area. Our halau resides on the ancestral lands of the Atfalari people. The Atfalari Indians were a small tribe of Oregon and the relatives of the Kalapuya tribes. Atfalari Indians were speakers of a northern Kalapuya dialect. Like many other West Coast Indian tribes, the Atfalari people were relocated to the Grand Ronde Reservation in Oregon during the 1800s. There, they were merged with other native tribes and their language rapidly vanished. The Atfalari Kalapuya language is no longer spoken today. But through the efforts of some of the young people working to learn their ancestral language, they hope to see a revival of a language that once flourished this aina, Eola no. Aloha. Again, we are Haliʻa o Lokelani, and our halau was founded in 2009 and has since made a home in the city of Hillsborough, again on the ancestral lands of the Atfalari tribes. And we want to, again, mahalo them for giving us an opportunity and a home where we can share our hula, we can share our love for Hawaii with the community here, and we hope to continue to learn about the tribes, the tribal lands that we occupy. And so again, our halau was founded with the mission to honor the heritage of Hawaii. And growing up in Hawaii, I definitely took for granted the rich culture that surrounded me as an olapa and a haumana of ke kula o na vihi o ka lani o pu'u. Being able to immerse ourselves in our culture and be surrounded by those who share in that same environment gave me the tools to carry on what our kupuna had set forth for us. Moving to the continent was definitely an eye-opener when it came to culture and what people envisioned Hawaii to be. At first, you're like, wow, geez, I can't believe they don't know, or why are they asking me questions that for me seemed like common knowledge. Well, as the years went on, I learned that ignorance that I was upset about was due to the lack of education. Many can argue that we all have to take the initiative to seek information and have the humility to recognize that we are always learning. I understand that. But for over a decade now, our ohana, our keiki, our hamana, our alakai, na poʻe a pau o ka halau a mena kako, all of our supporters who have come out and supported our events, our fundraisers, and all of the many ways we share the history and culture of Hawaii. We want to say mahalo for taking the initiative to recognize the need to know more about Hawaii. The impact we have made on the community has truly been humbling. Being able to walk into our keiki schools here on the continent and hear Hawaiian music, or having those tough conversations with the parent-teacher organizations to make sure that they are honoring our culture and not continuing to participate in the cultural appropriation we have seen for years, is definitely a mahalo to all of you folks. Being asked to represent the Hawaiian people throughout the state of Oregon and Washington with educational workshops, being a speaker, a panelist, a simple cultural advisor, and all of this is just a small example of what we have done throughout the years. So again, mahalo to all of you folks for taking the initiative to learn about Hawaii. Our halau continues to build a kahua, a foundation for our hamana and our ohana through our cultural values because of all of you. So again, mahalo nui loa. I wanted to, as again, this is our third week going into our Mālama Hōnua program, and although we may have covered like what it's about and all of that, we want to hope that every week we have new people coming to watch our Mālama Hōnua. And this week, just to give you a background, what our program is about, here is a little bit about the inspiration behind Mālama Hōnua. As many of you have witnessed in 2019, Mauna Awakea movement was definitely an awakening of a nation. Our indigenous lands of Hawaii have been abused for years. Our Hawaii has been misrepresented, misunderstood, and this country has misinformed so many about the history of Hawaii. Here in the schools here in the American history, our students learn about Hawaii in 2 paragraphs. Not sufficient enough. And for so long, my main focus was to help change that narrative and provide the mo'olelo of Hawaii that we were raised with. The oia i'o of Hawaii, the truth of Hawaii. Like I mentioned before, our halau has been so very privileged to have built the kahua, a foundation, in our communities and be allowed the opportunity to educate everyone about Hawaii. In September of 2019, an opportunity to unite with our kia'i in Hawaii from Oregon had presented itself. We were asked to accompany a production group and share the pule, oli, and mele of Hawaii. Knowing the importance of those who are leading the movement for the protection of our lands in Hawaii, we were happy to kako and show our aloha for Hawaii. A week before the event, a request for us to bring our pahu and ipu and hula, all of that, was asked of us, and we needed to bring them up to Mount Hood. Excuse me. I'm going to try to remember to change slides while I'm reading and talking to give you guys our background here. Kalawai. Here we are, Mount Hood. Now, at that point, I had been living here in Oregon for 14 years. 14 years. It wasn't until then that I too realized how ignorant and uneducated I was about the very aina that we live on. At that moment, I realized, gosh, they want us to go to Mount Hood, but there has to be a story. There has to be an Inoa Maoli. There has to be. And we learned his name is Wai'is. The mountain you see in the center of this slide, we know as Mount Hood, but his Inoa Maoli and the Inoa that are Native American ohana here on these land, they call him Wai'is. Mount Hood received its name in 1897 by a white author named Frederick Balk, was aware of the Multnomah tribe's name, Wai'is, but still renamed the mountain. It is said that Wai'is was the son of the Great Spirit Sahel. He and his brother Pato, and you can see to the left, you folks know this mountain as Mount Adams, had both fallen in love with a beautiful maiden named Luit. Also smitten by the two brothers, Luit could not decide who to love. And you see on our slide here, Luit to the right, you know her as St. Helens. Because of this love, the brothers burned villages and forests in their battle to win her love. Enraged by their behavior and carelessness for their people, the Great Spirit erected 3 mountain peaks to mark where each had fell to their deaths. These mountains continue to grace the landscapes of Oregon and Washington. There are multiple stories about these great mountains, and many tribes honor their greatness by sharing the stories that have been passed down from generation to generation. So because of this mo'olelo, because of the start of us heading up to Mount Hood, to Wai'is, and wanting to unite with our kia'i and to show our kako'o here from Oregon to Mauna Awakea, this manao of Mālama Hōnua started to build. The idea behind where are we? Whose land are we on? And I also want to give a mahalo to Confluence and NEA and all the other organizations that we have the privilege to be a part of, and all of the different tribes that we have met with who have brought that awareness to us to make sure that we do land acknowledgement. And just through that simple land acknowledgement, our halau has learned so much about these tribes. And the goal behind Mālama Hōnua was for us not to just take care of our earth, but to also learn about the lands here in Oregon, and to also continue to educate people about the lands in Hawaii and where we come from, and to continue to build that awareness. But together we have to bridge that understanding of the land that we are on now. We cannot ask people to know about our culture, and yet we have not done that for theirs. And so there's some videos, I know we've watched them, I'm going to just share with you guys. If you folks have the chance, please go and look up Hokulea and Uncle Nainoa Thompson and the Mālama Hōnua Worldwide Voyage. That really is where the mana'o stem from. It really came from this voyage and watching and everything. And one of the things that Uncle Nainoa Thompson says in this video is he says, Hokulea is pulling us into the direction of asking the question, are you going to be responsible and are you going to take action? And this question really set with me just because it's not just about what are we doing to take care. It's not just about the land, right? It's not it the land is very important, but it's also about the people and it's also about the cultures and the indigenous cultures that people tend to forget about and they don't recognize and we don't look back to what traditionally was done before. And so that particular saying was really what woke this Mālama Hōnua project up. Secondly, we were very privileged to have Lanakila Manguel come up last December to do Mana'o Mauna Kea and to teach us and to remind us about where we come from. But he also left us with the Mana'o of what are we doing here? What are we doing to learn about the lands here, about the indigenous people here? You know, all of the indigenous people, the whole Mana'o, the goal behind that worldwide voyage was to build connections. And what are we doing to build the connections here? And so with that Mana'o, we started this Mālama Hōnua project. Our halau, we divided the halau up into 8 separate huis, and each hui represented an island and represented a tribe. And although we know there is so much to offer in Hawaii and there's so much to offer here, we had to kind of narrow it down and just do the first steps of learning who we are as far as Hawaii as and who we are here in Oregon and who are the tribes and where do we live. And we also wanted to know what the challenges and what they were going through and all of that. Another big shout out I want to do is for Linda Mianis. She was my first I want to say speaker that I heard from, well, not one of the ones that moved me. There's a many, but you know, at the Oregon Historical Society, and just telling her stories and sharing her mo'olelo about her kupunas really helped us put together this project to unite and connect Hawaii with our Native American ohana here. Also, Confluence, Auntie Louise, mahalo once again for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to learn so much and to learn how our connection with Hawaii and with the Native American tribes here. So through all of that, our main goal for this program, and we hope that all of you take the time to learn and take the time to to really engage yourself and be a part of the conversation, be a part of why our the next generation, why our keiki need to know these stories, because we are the ones that carry the stories and we are the only ones who are able to make sure that these stories and our traditions and our values continue. And so this is our hope. Yeah, we want to build connections and a better road for the next generation, because in reality we owe it to them. We owe so much to them, and we owe it to them to give them a better place. So with that being said, I would like to welcome our hui for this week, um, Oahu. They're going to be representing Oahu as well as sharing the mana'o of the Confederated Tribes of Silet. So there we go. Aloha, Auntie Kim. I'm going to
Aloha.
switch off here. And okay, mahalo. You guys have the floor.
Thank you, Kumu. Let me just share our presentation. Can everyone see okay? So good evening and welcome to the 3rd episode of Mālama Hōnua. We are from Haliʻa o Lokelani, and we are here to share our mana'o from our research on the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the island of Oahu. Before we move forward, we would like to begin with our land acknowledgement.
As a member of this community here in Oregon, we would like to acknowledge and mahalo the land and its people to which we sit and occupy. The Portland metro area rests on the traditional village sites of Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Kotlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molala, and many other tribes, including those members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz. who made their homes along the Columbia River, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and use the plentiful natural resources of the area. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land, especially the Siletz people, who we have learned about in this work project, and have come to respect and appreciate for their common experiences with the native people of Oahu. Thank you.
This is a story about two cultures and our journey to learn about their common struggles as Indigenous people, the imposed oppression of their culture, and how their core strength is leading to their revitalization. This is information you may not have gotten in your history books. Our efforts are a combined attempt to retell a more accurate story from what we've been taught, and here are a few basic facts about both cultures.
Did you know that the word Silet means coil like a snake? It describes the river that surrounds the reservation. And did you also know that the Silet tribe is actually made of 27 bands? Each tribe has its own unique and individual history, and all the information we share today is not specific to one particular tribe, but to Confederate tribe as a whole. Next slide. The Oahu, known for the gathering place, the third largest Hawaiian island, approximately 1 million people, and the state capital, Honolulu, is on the southeast coast of the island. Hawaiian homeland on Oahu have 85,000 residential acres, home of Iolani Palace, America's only royal palace. Next slide.
As we began our journey of learning, we were curious to know what the Indigenous people of Oahu and of Oregon were experiencing at different points in time. So we put together this timeline to show the history of both peoples, with significant points in time as highlighted in red, that led to the loss of their lands, language, culture, and the revitalization of them. These are points that we'll be focusing on the next few slides. The yellow dots highlight common points in time within the 5 or 10 year period. Captain James Cook became the first European to explore the Hawaiian Islands when he sailed past the island of Oahu on January 18, 1778. The significant point about his arrival is that the indigenous Hawaiian people had forever been altered as a result of his arrival. His sailors introduced tuberculosis, measles, etc., which eventually killed thousands of indigenous people. They also introduced venereal diseases, which affected fertility for several generations. About 10 years later, in 1787, US Congress passed an organic act called the Northwest Ordinance. And why this is important to highlight is because the Northwest Ordinance, also known as the Utmost Good Faith Law, promised that indigenous people would be protected in their rights and property, that they would not be invaded or disturbed, and that laws would be made to prevent wrongdoings towards them and preserve peace and friendship with them. We will learn how the intent of this Utmost Good Faith Law would soon be ignored and forgotten. Another common point in time between both cultures is the Battle of Nu'uanu on Oahu in 1795 and the arrival of Lewis and Clark on the Pacific coast in 1805. Why the Battle of Nu'uanu is significant in the history of the indigenous Hawaiian people is because it was King Kamehameha I's key battle to unify the Hawaiian Islands. It is known as Kalele Ka'anai, which means the leaping mullet, and refers to a number of Oahu warriors driven off the cliff in the final phase of battle. After this battle, the kingdom was for the first time referred to as the Kingdom of Hawaii. 10 years later, Lewis and Clark reached the end of their trail at the Pacific coast in Oregon. And why this is significant is because similar to when Captain Cook arrived in Hawaii, The Lewis and Clark expedition brought the smallpox and other diseases along with settlers, the beginning of the fur trade in Oregon, and military interests, which we will soon learn all have significantly impacted the land, people, and culture of the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest. We're going to jump ahead a few years to 1819, when King Kamehameha II, given the name Liholiho, officially inherited the throne. He was a young king, and he co-reigned with Queen Ka'ahumanu, who was another wife of the late King Kamehameha I, and Liholiho's official guardian. During his reign, he overthrew the kapu system, which was the Hawaiian people's code of conduct, of laws and regulations. And Queen Ka'ahumanu accepted the arrival of Protestant missionaries from New England. This is a picture of Reverend Hiram Bingham and his wife, who began teaching in Honolulu. Bingham started what he called singing schools on Oahu, in which he taught native Hawaiian Protestant hymns. The reason why this is important to highlight is because this is the point in time when the Hawaiian people, when their ancient religious law system had ended, and the introduction of missionaries is what led to the eventual suppression of language and culture. Let's jump a few years to 1826, when the missionaries developed and finalized the Hawaiian alphabet. The Hawaiian language was an oral tradition, and the missionaries' goal was to print the Bible in Hawaiian. You'll note on the left that there are 12 consonants and 5 vowels. This was still an interim solution, as the foreigners were still trying to understand and learn the Hawaiian language. In the end, it was 9 missionaries, which included Reverend Bingham, who decided the future of the Hawaiian language with the Hawaiian alphabet that we know today, which consists of 7 consonants, 5 vowels, and 1 glottal stop, or okina. Let's take a moment and return to the timeline to get a perspective on where we are. Another key point in time is the Organic Act of 1848. So while the Oregon Territory became official with the Organic Act of 1848, defining of the boundaries began 2 years later with the treaty with Great Britain. The treaty brought Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Wyoming and Montana under US jurisdiction and ownership. And why this is important to highlight is because it begins the story of the federal government taking interest and ownership away from the indigenous people along the Pacific Northwest. In that same year was the Great Mahele, which was the Hawaiian land redistribution proposed by King Kamehameha III. Mahele means portion, division, or section. And the Great Mahele was one of the most important events in Hawaiian history, as it allowed for private ownership of land for the first time. And while intended to provide secure title to Hawaiians, it would eventually end up separating many of them from their land. And we will talk more about this shortly in the upcoming slides. 2 years later came the Oregon Donation Act in 1850, which was significant in shaping the course of Oregon history with the displacement of tribes and indigenous people from prime land. It divided land into square plots that allowed white males and married women to claim 320 acres of free land. This act validated white settlers' claims in the Willamette Valley and attracted a huge influx of people to Umpqua and Rogue Valleys. During the same year came the Alien Land Ownership Act and Kuleana Act in Hawaii, which, along with the Great Mahele, led to the loss of Hawaiian land. In the end, the local people ended up with less than 1% of total land available. So I think it's important to pause for a moment and talk a little bit about the history of land divisions on Oahu before the Mahele, because it is important to understand what once was to understand the gravity and magnitude of the loss today. Land division in Old Hawaii was called ahupua'a. The definition of ahupua'a means land division, usually extending from the uplands to the sea. The boundary was marked by a heap, or ahu, of stones, and typically a pig, pua'a, or other tribute was laid on the altar as a tax to the chief. The boundaries often followed a stream drainage. Each ahupua'a contained the resources the community needed. It was ruled by an ali'i, or ruler chief, and managed by a konohiki, or headman of land division. The commoners, or maka'ainana, were the stewards of the land. They were the canoe builders, the farmers, the fishermen, the net makers, the lauhala weavers, and other trades. Earlier, I mentioned the kapu system that was abolished. This kapu system was the order of law that kept everything and everyone in balance. It placed restrictions on fishing certain species during specific seasons, planting and gathering plants, and governed social interactions. Everyone contributed to take care of the land and traded with each other. There was a complete balance, and the community maintained a sustainable lifestyle. This olelo no'eo, or Hawaiian proverb, says, "Hanau ka'aina, hanau ke ali'i, hanau ke kanaka." Born was the land, born were the chiefs, born were the people. And it just describes the relationship of every person and their roles and the importance of them in this balanced ecosystem. Oahu's fertile land became moneymakers for the foreigners. After the mahele came the rise of plantations. Sugar, rice, and other crops required water and land. So water was diverted from streams, forests were cleared for land, and with the Hawaiians moving out because they lost their lands, along with the reduction of the Hawaiian population due to the spread of diseases, the result was a complete disintegration of Mālama Hōnua. That natural balance was destroyed. Today, there are about 1 million people living on Oahu and about 85,000 residential acres belonging to Hawaiian homelands. It is a sad story, but what's encouraging is there are efforts today to restore balance on Oahu with the building of kipuka, or small patches of land with greenery in the middle of old lava flows, which in time will eventually become forests and replenish the lands, and the effort to restore fish ponds. We can tell you almost the exact same story about the indigenous people that make up the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. Going back to the timeline, we're going to jump ahead to 1855 with Tanya sharing more about significant events that have steered the course of the indigenous people's histories.
Thank you, Kim. In 1855, the Coast Reservation was established for the Siletz tribe. The area covered about 1.1 million acres. The map on the left shows the numerous different languages that was represented by the indigenous people along the coast. The map on the right shows many of the different changes and reductions that happened as a result of the Rogue River Wars. It is estimated that of the 9,500 Indian people living in this region, there were fewer than 2,000 survivors of the Rogue River Wars. Next slide, please. So part of the issue is this period began the initial removal and relocation of Native peoples from their land in the Rogue Valley. In no way can I do justice in telling what happened, point to point, executive order, and select allotment and reallotment over time. The primary takeaway is showing the progressive process of land taken, people moved, and the redrawing of land allocation. At this same time along the timeline was the reign of King Kamehameha IV and Queen Emma. They established the Queen's Medical Center. Next slide. Executive Order 1865. This is a very important point. Going back to 1855, the Siletz Indians were given a tract of land on the Oregon coast from Cape Lookout to Cape Perpetua. The Executive Order of 1865 by President Pierce resulted in moving Native peoples off previously designated reservation lands. At this time, King Kamehameha V was known to encourage the revival of traditional practices such as Hawaiian medicine, also known as la'au lapa'au. Next slide. Indian Appropriation Act of 1875. As you can see from the map on the left, the indigenous people were in this area, but time after time, moment after moment, pieces of their land was taken away. Indian Appropriation Act of 1875 made it much easier for the federal government to secure lands that had previously been owned by the tribal nations. And on the right is a picture of King David Kalakaua. During the reign of King David Kalakaua during 1874 to 1891, the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom came into being. Well aware of his cultural Hawaiian roots, Kalakaua created a palace hula troupe. King David Kalakaua had an appreciation for authentic art of hula. And Kaya will say more about this important figure in Hawaiian history. Next slide, please. 1892 Siletz Allotment and Surplus Lands Agreement. Due to heavy taxation of lands owned by individual Siletz tribal members, this led to an inability to pay taxes and the loss of traditionally held reservation lands. By 1912, over half of the Siletz allotments had been removed from Indian ownership. The next slide shows the systemic decrease of Siletz lands over time. As you can see, the slide on the left shows the original lands held by the Siletz. However, the slide on the right shows the present day lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Next slide. Kim will now continue from this point.
Alrighty, guys. So now we're going to go through the 20th century. On July 9th, 1921, the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act took place, which took 203,500 acres of public lands under the jurisdiction of the Hawaiian Homes Commission, which was to be leased to Hawaiian Home beneficiaries for a 99-year lease. Then in 1954, the Termination Act took place that affected many tribes, including the Siletz and other tribes, which means that those tribes were broken up and their land was sold. In 1959, a few years later, Hawaii became the 50th state of America. I think next slide, please. In 1978, the Hawaiian language was recognized as one of the official languages of the state of Hawaii. And then in 1977, the Siletz tribe was recognized and restored, and members were able to receive healthcare, education, and other federal services, as well as being able to protect existing tribal and fishing and hunting rights, as you can see on the pictures. Next slide, please. In the early 1980s, the first Athabascan language classes began in Siletz. In 1996, it was discovered that they have lost more than 90% of the ability to speak the native language Athabascan. Having survived termination and regained federal recognition as sovereign nations, Oregon tribes have persisted to control their own destinies. As of 2015, there are 566 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And in 1986, after years of advocacy, Aha Punana Leo successfully works with the Hawaii State Legislature to pass a bill removing a 90-year ban on teaching in Hawaiian in public and private schools. Next slide. And then we go to 1989, the National Museum of American Indian Act and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which protects Indian graves on federal and tribal lands, and Siletz heads east, requiring museums to repatriate sacred objects and cultural objects not associated with grave sites that have been stolen or improperly acquired. Then in 1993, Congress apologized to Native Hawaiians for its role in overthrowing the monarchy and committing itself to a process of reconciliation. Next slide, please. In 1996, the new dance house was complete, enabling the traditions of the Siletz tribe to be showcased. As you can see some pictures. So this timeline was built to help us understand what the indigenous people of Oahu and of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians were experiencing at the different points in time. What we have found as we took that journey through time is a very common story of how their lands, language, and culture were lost. And as we move on with our presentation, a common story of restoration and revitalization of both cultures. We also discovered that both cultures have more in common than we realized. Kaya will now expand on that topic.
We discovered that basket weaving and other weaving arts were common practice in both cultures. In Hawaiian basket weaving, some of the materials that were used were lauhala leaves, ʻeʻe rootlets, and makaloa sedge. They also used the same weaving techniques to make mats, baskets, fans, fish traps, sandals, bed coverings, and clothing. The arrival of Western man and an increase in trade with the outside world in the 19th century caused the decline of weaving, and some of the weaving skills had disappeared almost entirely. Today, out of all of the weaving arts, ulana lauhala continues to be the most practiced. Basket making is a Native American cultural tradition for the Siletz people. Cradle baskets, ceremonial hats, cooking baskets, and working baskets were made for carrying firewood, roots, and clams, and were woven using hazel switches, spruce roots, cattails, rushes, and cedar bark. The fine fibers of wild iris leaves were also used. These useful and beautiful baskets were often embellished with bear grass, dyed woodwardia, and maidenhair fern designs. Today, high-quality baskets are still being made on the Siletz Reservation, and the North Lincoln County Historical Museum in Lincoln City, Oregon, has many of the baskets on display. Next slide, please. Another common cultural practice between the Hawaiian and Siletz people is dancing. Hula was how the stories of the Hawaiian people were expressed and remembered in absence of a formal written language. It was how history and religion were carried from one generation to the next. As Auntie Kim mentioned earlier, after the missionaries arrived, Queen Kaahumanu banned hula in public. But about 50 years later, under King David Kalakaua's reign, he restored Hawaiian cultural practices, including hula, to the people of Hawaii. He has forever been known as the Merry Monarch, he who restored the legacy of hula to Hawaiians. Every year, the Merry Monarch Festival continues what the king started, by hosting a week-long festival of music, crafts, art, demonstrations, and a hula competition in Hilo, Hawaii. Next slide, please. In his words, hula is the language of the heart and therefore the heartbeat of the Hawaiian people. After the suppression of the Hawaiian culture, for so many decades, he brought a sense of pride back to the Hawaiian people. Next slide, please. Similar to the Hawaiian people, dancing played a role in religious rituals and other ceremonies of the Siletz people. Some of their dances were held to guarantee the success of hunts and harvests, or to give thanks in other celebrations. Like the Hawaiian people, dancing was banned. In fact, in 1883, Congress banned all native dances and ceremonies. The Religious Crime Code of 1883 gave the government authority to imprison and withhold rations to stop any cultural practices they thought were immoral or against the government-mandated assimilation policies. Today, powwow dancing is celebrated throughout the year, and the general public is welcome to attend to experience and learn about American Indian culture and dance. More information about powwow dances held by the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians is provided at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. In both cultures, there is a spiritual aspect of dancing as well. The earliest forms of Hawaiian dances, The mele hula were used either in their temple form, ha'a, or their public form, hula. Ha'a were usually performed as part of a worship in the temple, heiau, under the direction of a priest, kahuna. These dances were often done with rituals and ceremonies related to the specific temple and also to the specific gods or goddesses within those temples. Other hula honored the ali'i, the chiefs and royalty, whose genealogies often linked them to the gods. The image on the right is of a young member performing the nidash, or traditional feather dance. In our research, we have noted that nidash is spelled differently. Every summer and winter solstice for hundreds of years, the nidash would be held for 12 years at a place called Yonkintonket, which means the center of the earth. This is their ceremony to participate in the remaking of the universe. This is their genesis or creation story. In more recent years, a new tradition has started. During the winter solstice, dancers, singers, and tribal members from the Confederated Tribes visit the Toloa people's cedar plank dance house near Smith River, California. I would like to introduce Auntie Ruth Ann to talk about the language of both cultures.
Thank you, Kaya. The language is sacred. It is in jeopardy. The Siletz could not let that lie. As a matter of duty, of honor, the old sounds need to be heard in some meaningful fashion. It is part of survival. The language of the Siletz is closely tied to the creator, as well as to the people and to the land. The Siletz took on the monumental task of reviving their language so that both speakers and listeners could communicate within a cultural context. This quote is taken from The People Are Dancing Again by Charles Wilkinson. This book was written by the lawyer that represented the Siletz during the early steps of restoration. And he had earned such respect from the tribe that he was asked by the tribe to write their tribal history. This book was an excellent source of information for our group and clearly illustrates the history and the revitalization of the Siletz tribes. Next slide, please. Language is the key to culture. The picture on the left is actually in a hotel on Oahu. The Hawaiian alphabet and various common objects cover a large area of the common space in the hotel, and they represent an impressive community education effort. If you were to visit, you would see beautifully crafted in wood and labeled by their Hawaiian names. On the right, the stone is in a graveyard near the Siletz Reservation. It simply reads ancestor. Perhaps the person is unknown by name, but their honor and their place in the tribe is preserved by this respectful title. Next slide, please. As we have already learned, both the people of Oahu and Siletz had similar experiences imposed upon them by non-natives and non-Indians. One of them was an effort to silence their mother tongues. The Hawaiian language is considered to be one of the oldest living languages in the world. At first, it was only a spoken language. And as we have already heard, Captain Cook arrived in 1778, and 42 years later, the missionaries that followed converted the Hawaiian language into a written form so that they could tell stories from the Bible. They taught the Hawaiians how to read and write, and they translated the Bible into Hawaiian for teaching purposes. This was the first big change to the Hawaiian language. Another big change happened following the annexation of Hawaii as a US territory in 1898. After that, the Hawaiian language was forbidden to be used in schools and in government. As Kim Mokuau mentioned earlier, this ended up being a really long ban, a 90-year ban of the Hawaiian language. Similar things happened also to the Siletz tribe. It is important to understand that each of the 20 different tribes that were displaced to the Siletz reservation had their own language. Over time, those 20 different languages were consolidated into 5 major languages. In addition to these 5, there was also Chinook jargon, which was a simple communication of phrases used only for trading. Eventually, Coast Athabascan emerged as the most primary language, but over time, as we have heard, that too became almost lost with the passing on of the elders who were the majority of the native speakers. Next slide, please. For both the Hawaiian and the Siletz people, there were growing efforts to give new life to their native languages. And in each situation, there was one person who took that lead for that culture. On Oahu, that person was Larry Kimura. He was a young professor at the University of Hawaii in the 1970s, and he hosted a radio show. So with the help of the many, many native speakers that he interviewed, he taught himself the Hawaiian language. His show was so popular that it sparked great interest in keeping the language of the Hawaiian people alive. By 1978, Hawaiian was recognized as one of the 3 official languages of Hawaii, with English and Pidgin being the other 2 official languages. The valiant efforts of many language activists resulted in Hawaiian language immersion preschools that started in 1984. Now there are over 30 Hawaiian immersion schools on all the islands. And at the University of Hawaii, degrees in the Hawaiian language are offered all the way up to a PhD level. It is now estimated that there are over 24,000 native speakers. After the Siletz were restored to tribal status in 1975, the hope to rekindle their language was also restored. In the 1980s, the first Athabascan language classes began. By 1994, a keyboard-friendly format for the Athabascan language was created, which made documentation possible and curriculum development much easier. Like Larry Kimura in Hawaii, Bud Lane in Siletz taught himself the Athabascan language. He worked with a tribal elder named Nellie Orton and methodically worked his way through their language. He was recruited in 2003 to head up the program in the cultural department to preserve the traditional arts and language. And changes accelerated after that. The Siletz tribe successfully petitioned for a charter school. This charter school became an independent entity and a nonprofit under state law, making it effectively a tribal program. In 2005, classes were taught in Athabascan in the Siletz Valley schools, and this was done in partnership with tribal preservation efforts. Bud Lane continues his strong influence for language revitalization. In addition to teaching at the Siletz Valley Charter School, he teaches classes at the area tribal offices in Eugene, in Salem, and in Portland. His persistent focus has slowly grown the body of those speaking Athabascan. One of his most recent projects has been to transliterate the Athabascan English language into a talking dictionary. And this has over 14,000 words and phrases captured on interactive audio files. Next slide, please. In a past interview, Bud Lane was happy to acknowledge that the current generation is now growing up without a personal memory of the termination or the separation, unlike people of his generation. He says, these young people know our ceremonies, they know our language, they know our songs. They don't know any other time. He goes on to say that he has great hope and faith that our culture will be preserved for the generations yet unborn that are going to come into the world. And as this quote says, for our children, their children, and their children. And now I'd love to introduce Amanda, who will give us a taste of what this language sounds like.
Thank you, Ruth Ann. We hope that you guys have started to learn a few things about the Sealets and Oahu Native people, the struggles that they've had and the accomplishments that they've overcome to ensure the future generations could continue to learn. Here are a few words from the Hawaiian and the Athabascan languages. The first word we have is story. In Hawaiian, it's pronounced mo'olelo. In Athabascan, it sounds like
story, not shape.
The second word of importance is language. In Hawaii, the word is pronounced olelo. In Athabascan, it's pronounced
Language. Way up.
something we can all relate to is family. In Hawaiian, it's pronounced ohana. In the Athabascan language, it sounds like
Family. Tateyo.
the last word that we have is something that is important to both the Hawaiian and the Sealets tribe. That's dance. In Hawaiian, it's hula. In Sealet, it is
Happy dance movement. Matsnai.
learning the Athabascan language. How it's written and spoken has been very interesting. The next slide that we have is about the Hawaiian language. In the movement to preserve the Hawaiian language, an old proverb has been provided. I ka'olelo no ke ola, I ka'olelo no ke maka, which reads, in speech is life, in speech is in death, meaning that the language can heal and the language can destroy. The importance is that the Hawaiian language and Hawaiian culture will flourish. Without it, it will die. Now I'd like to introduce you to Maud, who will help explain more to you about Oahu.
Here, we're going to talk about some of the issues that the island of Oahu face today. One of them are the land issue. With the population of 1 million people on the island, that come with the housing crisis, affordable housing shortage. Despite all that building activity, Honolulu has some of the highest housing price in the country. And also the homelessness. In January of 2020, approximately 4,000 people experienced homeless. And also the high cost of living. The Honolulu is the 9th most expensive city in the US. Also the traffic is the 19th most congested city in the US. And we also have the issue about Iolani Palace. The palace is owned and maintained by and operate, the palace is maintained and operated by the nonprofit Friend of Iolani. The Friend revenue come from the operation of the gift shop, palace tour ticket special event and donation. But since the parade shut down in March, it's lost about $500,000. And also the local projects protest. In September 2019, Honolulu police handcuffed 28 mostly Native Hawaiian protests at Waimanalo Bay Beach Park. Residents opposed to construction of the ball field where they believe EV are buried. Then a month later, Honolulu police arrest 55 people who blocked the road in attempt to stop the delivery of the wind turbine part opposed to Napua Makani wind farm. And of the Hawaiian Island share some of the environment issues such as the water quality, tourism, invasive species, and air qualities. And what is still struggling today is being a good steward to the land and having a respect for the tradition, scared land of the indigenous people. Kim?
So now I'm going to talk about some of the issues that the Siletz people face today. And one of them is cultural appropriation. So we must remember like how many Native Hawaiians come in all shapes of colors and sizes, so do the people of the Siletz tribe. Part of cultural appropriation is also recognizing that we are all on land that was not given to us without a cost, and it is our responsibility to acknowledge and educate ourselves. As the climate changes, so does the water and food source many Native Americans rely on, and this has been an increasing obstacle that the Siletz people are facing. Culture and traditions, making sure that their culture and traditions are kept alive is always a constant and important issue. And another issue is wellness that many people face as well as the Siletz tribe. They have challenges with PTSD, domestic abuse, mental health, and there's also a huge issue with women and girls being murdered on the reservation, and there are resources available, but it is something that is not always brought to light. Next, we will have Auntie Tanya discuss our plan of action.
Word by word, we are trying to teach ourselves what we got dropped between the generations and hold on. Next slide. Land acknowledgement. It has become common practice to do so during events that bring people together. This is in keeping with the understanding that land has memory. Our project has resulted in a process of sharing knowledge and improved awareness of history of the land and the importance of culture and community. Individual kuleana, responsibility. Kuleana embodies the meaning of a person's responsibility to oneself, to act honestly and with integrity. We are therefore accountable in our actions within our families and communities. It has been our kuleana to learn as much as we could about the indigenous peoples of the Siletz tribe. During this journey, we gained an increased awareness of the similarities in which the historical, political, and economic policies of the US have been enacted against the Siletz and the peoples of Oahu. In keeping with Mālama Hōnua, we request that you consider donating to support the restoration of cultural heritage and the arts through the Daughters of Hawaii Historical Society and the Siletz Tribal Arts and Heritage Society. The mission of the Siletz Tribal Arts and Heritage Society is to promote and support the practice, conservation, and restoration of tribal cultures of the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. The Daughters of Hawaii Historical Society was founded to perpetuate the memory and spirit of old Hawaii, historic facts, and preserve the correct pronunciation of the Hawaiian language. Their volunteers assist in the preservation and maintenance of 3 historic Hawaiian sites, including King Kamehameha III's birth site in kailua kona. Again, it is our kuleana to share this information with our families and communities. It is also our goal to support the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. In this way, we can understand more fully the significance of where we have stood and continue to stand throughout our respective histories. With this knowledge, we can share our breath, and greet each other with increased knowledge and respect. Ruth Ann will now continue with a discussion of our resources.
Thank you, Tanya. Our group is committed to continue to learn about the history and culture that we've started to learn about. And when we can safely travel, perhaps we will visit some of the sites that we learned about. So that your learning can continue, here are some key resources available to you to explore more about the Hawaiian people and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indian. We encourage you to visit these sites to learn more about these Native peoples. And now we'd like to close with introducing our team members and have each share their own key takeaways. Amanda?
Thank you, Ruth Ann. My takeaways from this project is the simple fact that both the Siletz tribe and the Native Oahu people had so much in common with the things that they've had to overcome throughout history. I found it interesting the way that the Athabascan language is both written and spoken, and both the Siletz and Oahu people had representatives on each side to help kind of revive the language and put that back into current, education and to pass that on to generations. It was also really neat to learn that the Nidash was somewhat different than the general powwow dance, and that it had such a deeply spiritual meaning, as well as the fact that the Hawaiian dance has that aspect too. The similarities between the two were very interesting to learn. The fact that some of the time frame throughout history, there was parts where both the Hawaiian and the Nidash were forbidden. Thankfully today they've both been, I guess, come back to where we can enjoy them and take a part of them. So it's been a really interesting project to learn throughout the year.
Thank you, Amanda, for sharing. Can we bring on Kalena? And Kalena, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Kalena. I've learned a lot about a lot of things during this study, and as Auntie Amanda said, I also learned a lot about how Siletz and Oahu people are very alike and share the same kind of problems and just other things in general. For example, they both dance for their culture. They make a whole bunch of things from scratch, from baskets to teepees, all that kind of stuff. And sadly, they've both had a lot of their land taken away from them. And as Auntie Tanya said before, I encourage anyone to donate to the links a few slides above or wherever you can, because it would help a lot of people, families. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalena. And if Auntie Ruth Ann can join on now.
Yes, thank you. So I dance with Papa Le'i Lima, and working on this project has been both eye-opening and very humbling. At the start of the Mālama Hōnua project, there was so much that I didn't know, And now I might know a little bit more, but there is still so much more that I don't know. But now that my awareness and knowledge have grown, I personally strive to keep learning, to be open-minded, and to share what I've learned with others and encourage them to continue to explore and grow so that they can have a greater understanding of all people in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie. Kaya?
My name is Kaya, and I dance with the Papalehua Ua. And working on this project has been a way for me to learn more about the history of the state I live in. I was amazed about how the cultural traditions were very similar. It was awesome. And this is an amazing way for me to learn and find more about different cultures. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaya. And next we have Natalie.
Hi, my name is Natalie or Maud. This is my 5th year with the Halau. Working on this project taught me a lot of things that I didn't know before, and it's definitely brought more awareness about both cultures. It's made me want to know and learn more.
Thank you, Maud. And Tanya's next.
Hello, my name's Tanya. I began dancing with Papa Lua'e this past January. And in working with this project, I've gained a bit more knowledge. Of course, there's more that I need to work on, but the key is to know more. Therefore, we can come together with greater solidarity. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tanya. And I'd like to bring on Kim.
Hi, my name is Kim. I've been with the Halau for 3 years. I learned so much about the culture, struggles, and triumphs that the Native Americans and Hawaiians have endured. My takeaway is that even though this history and facts can be upsetting, we can take that pain and turn it into something positive and make it a personal goal to share the knowledge we have all learned. Thank you.
And finally, me. So my name is Kim Sherwood. I've been with Papa Lawa'e for about 2 years. Mālama Hōnua, right, means to be good stewards of this earth and of each other. And before settlers arrived, the earth was well cared for by the indigenous peoples. And, just with greed and money, land ownership and all that stuff, a lot of stuff got destroyed. So what is my personal key takeaway? That reconciliation starts with acknowledgement and remembering, and then change starts with me. And check myself with my intentions, do all things with humility and respect, and take care of the land and the people that I have been entrusted with, and teach my children to do the same. So we want to give a big mahalo for taking time out to spend with us as we shared what we've learned. This is not the end of our journey. We are still learning, and we hope that you were inspired to learn more and will join us in taking some form of action to Mālama Hōnua. So thank you.
Yay! Mahalo, 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 all of you, all of your hard work. So much has gone into it. Again, every week, you gotta hold back the tears from learning. So mahalo to all of you folks for doing this. Shout out to our Kulakai Puni schools. Puna Leo, definitely a product of that education system. So mahalo for that. I hope for our Select tribes, they are able to revive and have their language live the way that we can honor our Hawaiian language. So mahalo nui to all of you folks. Next week we are here sharing the island of Maui. Maui o Pi'ilani is going to be here sharing their mana'o, as well as the stories of the Klamath tribes here in Oregon. So please join us next week, Friday, November 6th. I had to think of the date, November 6th. Next week, Friday at 6:30. Also, our Hui Lanai, who isn't going to be sharing to November 20th, has asked if we did a little sharing and a little shout out. They are in the process, part of their Hui is to do a they are reaching out to our Congress here in Oregon to help support the Warm Springs tribes. And although each week all of us are sharing about our own tribes that we're learning, the reality is we all need to help each other. And so if you can, we have a, I'm going to be posting it in our Facebook page. There is a sign our petition on Move On. We are over 100 signatures right now, but we really need you folks to join us to Kahoʻonei, our Warm Springs tribes down there, as they are suffering from the lack of water. Simple as that, just the lack of water. So all of us here up in the northern areas, we don't see those problems, we don't see those issues, but they're suffering down there. So if you can please join us. All our tribes are suffering. They all need to be recognized. They all need to be honored. And one of the things that I want to take from this hui, I was invited to sit in when they were able to speak with Taisi. And Taisi said the one thing that our Native American families want is just acknowledgement. It's just to be acknowledged and just to be recognized and to know that this is their land and we are just visitors. So always remember that. But again, mahalo. Join us next week as we head to Maui and Klamath Falls at Mālama Hōnua, 6:30 p.m. live right here on Kaleihalio Lokelani. Mahalo to everybody. Aloha, hui ho.